Hi, I'm Keegan. This is GM Talks. I am joined by my lovely assistant, Brennan.
Hello.
And, today we are interviewing Scarlett. Scarlett's been a long time fan of the podcast and the Facebook page, and so we asked her to come along and talk with us on the show.
Hello, I'm Scarlett, as already noted. I am 24 years old. I am a trans feminine non-binary person, which basically just means that I do not identify with the gender male that I was assigned at birth, but I also don't fully identify with the female gender. Yeah, I really like the podcast, and I'm really glad that I'm allowed to be here and talk to you.
Yeah, I sorry about the spoiler when I posted the latest episode though.
That's fair. It only served to make me more excited because I'm still not all the way caught up, but I can kind of just cobble together, and I'm pretty sure I know what's gonna be happening. But it's still very exciting. I'm still very keen.
Good, good. Yeah, it was because Lexi was just not feeling werewolf, so she wanted to bow out of the game, and so we decided to make it a flashpoint in the story.
That's fair. Yeah, I've also had a similar thing happening in a game that I run where I had a player have their character die because they just weren't feeling it. Well, at least not feeling playing a Garou character. They now play a spirit, which is an NPC in the game, which is I can imagine is for some people is easier because the way that the world in Werewolf is set up and the world of darkness in general is very grimdark. And I think for some people it can just be an anxious experience because unlike a lot of role-playing games, you just have this constant reminder of the consequences of your actions and stuff like that. And I can see where that's something that's not the thing for everyone.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I think also the heavy spirituality aspect turned some people off, which is fair. Yeah. That definitely permeates a lot of Werewolf.
Yeah. I think that that is actually one of my favorite aspects of the entire game, to be very fair. Because I don't see that in many games. A lot of more well-known tabletop role-playing games seem very gimmicky to me, and I like that Werewolf has this seriousness to it while still not seeming pretentious, which I think is sort of done by the fact that the parody aspects are pretty big, with O'Tooleys and is it pronounced O'Tolleys or O'Tooleys?
I've heard it both ways. I've went with O'Tulleys.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the parody aspect of it, I think you've seen what I like. My parody of Magic: The Gathering, which is Sorcery: The Symposium and stuff like that. And I just like being a bit it's kind of funny, and it just kind of makes it not seem pretentious to me at least. But I do like the spiritual aspect of it.
Yeah, I think the art helps inform that too. A lot of the art is very comic booky in a lot of ways, at least in older books.
Oh yeah, so this is kind of I was on a school trip in 2015 in Austria, and I found at a comic store that they had this box, this cardboard box of really old comics, and among them was the official Werewolf the Apocalypse art book. And it was still in the original wrapping, it wasn't unwrapped or anything. And they were the person working the store at the time didn't even know what to charge for it because she had absolutely no idea what it was or how long it'd been in the basement. And I was just kind of I will take that, and I still have that. But if you've seen that art book, it's very it's very cartoonish, and it makes a lot of the things in the game look very childish, at least to me. And I don't think it's terrible, it just is very different from the way that the game is presented nowadays.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think it's all over the place. I think it's because there are some that are pencil drawings that just get to me in a visceral sort of way, and then there are some where it's you brought in an exalted artist for this sketch.
Yeah, and that's a thing that's interesting to me because the way that I've I only got into Werewolf when 20th Anniversary Edition came out. I first started playing role-playing games in 2012, 2013 when I was 16, and the first game I played was Chronicles of Darkness. But the game very quickly switched to the, at that time, fresh release 20th anniversary edition of Werewolf the Apocalypse. And the way that I've been like told it by people who've been playing much longer is that Werewolf the Apocalypse, especially in like the Year of the Lotus and stuff like that, was very different in tone than it is now, I think. At least that's what I've heard people say.
I think there were some tone shifts. We actually started, me and Brennan, I suggested our first Werewolf the Apocalypse game years after the line actually ended. And we started with Revised Edition. And I found a couple metaplot elements and I cut them out. But, excuse me. But that tone was a lot more grandiose. And a lot more epic in feel. There was a lot more.
Was that where we played hide and go seek with the dragon?
Yes. So.
Okay.
And then go ahead.
That was a wild romp through every theme we could possibly do.
Sounds interesting for sure.
It was. We had a red talon at the sept they were at, and they'd always steal a car and drive it back to the sept, and so they'd piss off the red talon warder, and he'd shift to Krinos, crush the car, and just huck it into the woods. And so they just keep having to steal another car.
That wasn't Spotlight, was it?
No.
In the Sept of the Green? The Sept of the Green New York canonically has a red talon warder, and I think he's the warder. But the game that I've been the very first Werewolf game I played, starting in 2012, 2013, actually is still kind of going on. We're currently on pause until one player finishes her master thesis. But a big thing was that the warder at the Sept of the Green eventually picked up the Black Fury gift that let him grow wings, because our pack had a Corax, and he really did not appreciate having someone fly in from the top without him being able to intervene. It was like it was a huge thing. It was pretty funny.
No, I have this habit of building all of my septs from scratch, and that sept was no exception with the green. I knew the green existed, and I took some elements from the books, but I ended up creating every single Garu character that lived there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For our last game. And those characters, because I did not want to make the Sept of the Green from scratch again, just got transferred over to this game. Including Brennan's character from the last game, because that campaign was the campaign of the Fire Starters, which included Malcolm.
Yeah.
Okay. I like Malcolm as a character.
I do too. I don't know portray him as best as I could, as well as I could, but I
personally,
like
I think the episodes with him in it are like some of the most fun to me, at least, because I like the dynamic of like having I don't know, it just makes the pack dynamic a lot like very interesting to me.
Yeah. Cool.
That makes sense. So, because Brennan's character, or Malcolm at this point in the timeline, is an Adrian, and the rest of them were Cleoth, and Brennan as a player didn't want to overwrite their decision making, so there was this dynamic where they kept trying to like look up to him, and he's like, "Figure it out on your own."
Yeah,
I know more. Do it yourself.
I can really understand that. I think the game that I was playing at for years, the characters, we started out as cubs, but after in 2019, we are like at this time in 2020, we're all elders of rank, and we still sort of have this reflex where it's like, we're in trouble, time to call someone on the phone, and the person would be like, I'm an elder, all of you are elders too, what are you doing, why are you calling me, and this kind of stuff. And I think it's kind of funny because it's always like you always try to like look towards people who you feel have more knowledge, but sometimes you just gotta like think for yourself, basically.
Yeah.
Is this the game you said you started in 2013?
Yeah, 2013, 2012. I'm not actually sure which it was. Sometime around then. I think it was 2000. It had to be the beginning of 2013 because 20th anniversary edition came out then. But we might have started in 2012 because we started originally playing Chronicles of Darkness, a like human investigator game, and then like the storyteller moved towns because they switched universities, and one player who was a player in that like Chronicles of Darkness game took over as DST, and he's been storytelling ever since, and that's Werewolf basically.
Okay.
This is a long game. That's impressive.
Yeah, I originally started playing a Pumonka, which is the Puma shifters, the Bastet. And he was a very interesting character. He eventually died a very heroic death. It was a very emotional thing. I think in parts it was more emotional for us as players. Actually, no, it was very emotional for the characters, but it was also very emotional for the players. But in some way, I don't think the character would have died if I hadn't already like accepted that. I think because the way that it played out, though, this we were playing a whole weekend, and my character was in this situation where I was just sure he'd die, and then we like had this cliffhanger, and we only played again like weeks after, and I was just kind of like, you know, I was really caught up about it, and I was really emotional about it, and eventually I was like, you know what, I'm gonna play a new character, and I kind of like told the storyteller that I was a-okay with him like killing off the character, and he ended up like dying. He basically sacrificed himself to protect the rest of the pack. It's like a mixed Farah pack, so we originally only had one werewolf, a Black Fury, Arun. We had a Bastet, a Korax, my Bastet, and at times a Mokole and a Fox Shifter too.
Okay.
That sounds
and it
like
was
a
very
blast.
Yeah, it was very colorful. It was very interesting. But then, like, basically, my character died a hero's death. He protected the rest of the pack, sacrificed himself. He was granted a hero's funeral at the cairn that our characters run. And I basically showed up to the character with to the game within the character, a Bonor Galliard. And I think the interesting thing for me was that I originally started playing a male character, which was a long time before I realized I was not a man in real life. And I just sort of gradually made that character more feminine presenting, to the point where we had this like ancestral memory thing where my character was a woman and became an honorary member of the Black Furies, which sort of transferred to him in the present, and it was just like this thing, this transition that happened, and then I switched to playing a female character from the start with my new character, and I was just I think in a big part there was an important what's the word, milestone of my transition and my coming to accepting that I am not a man and that I'm transgender and that I wanted to like live as a woman in my everyday real life, basically.
It's really cool.
Was that something that you worked with your storyteller on, or was that something that you just sort of evolved through gameplay?
Actually I only came out to the storyteller in the group sometime last year. So a long time after I came out to pretty much everyone, and a long time after, like a really long time after I'd known for myself. But I think the transition of my male character, Chebejo, the Bastet, to being more feminine was just a gradual thing. I originally started, so he was a Fellas born, so he was like, that's basically Lupus born but for Bastet. So he was born a Puma, and he'd never really understood like human gender roles and all that stuff, because he just didn't understand it, because animals don't really have that. And he was in parts also a long time like just a kind of comic relief sometimes. Like there was a recurring thing where humans, both men and women, like would slip him phone numbers because he had appearance 5, and he just did not understand it. He was completely like confused by what those squiggly lines on paper meant that people kept sliding him, to the point where the Black Fury had to explain to him that those were a sort of in heat card is what she explained it, like in German, of course. And it was this comic relief thing, and he just became gradually more the way that I kind of wanted to present in real life, and more feminine. And then I like made the new character and started out with a female character in the first place then. And I didn't like actually address that as being a transition until years later. Because I didn't come out to most people until years later after that. And at the time, I'm actually not sure if I was actually aware of it. It was for like a lot of people, the trans experience is that you try to ignore and you try to push down those feelings and you try to like hide and mask and like just pretend that you're someone you're not. And that's why a lot of people see like coming out as this huge thing where you free yourself from all those things in some way.
Do you think maybe that's something that drew you to werewolf as well? The ability to change, and maybe it being analogous to the first change, that swell up where it couldn't be, contained anymore, and then it just,
In ways, yes. I'm also autistic, so the whole thing with the curse and humans just instinctually not liking you or being afraid of you or just having this wary feeling about you is something that when I was 16 and I started playing Werewolf, I related to, because in a way, I just felt like whenever I met people, I would inevitably cause them to dislike me just by way of being me. And that it was also like partially influenced by me being trans, because the big thing is that I didn't know I was trans, but I never like was able to like uphold those ideas that people had of what a boy and what a man should do. And even when I didn't see myself as being feminine in any way, and still don't really do, I like people in high school and like even going back as far as kindergarten, people would try to bully me for being feminine, and I never saw myself as feminine, but to some people it was kind of obvious. And that's a thing that I kind of relate to the curse in Werewolf, because it's this like thing where people just instinctually feel this way about you, and in a way it's something that you do not want, that you cannot stop. But it's just like this thing. But I also, I think that being able to shapeshift the way that like Werewolf does it, or the way that the Chimishe in Vampire do it, or the way that you're able to do it in Changeling, is something that appeals to a lot of trans people and queer people in general. And I think in some ways also like minorities of other kinds.
That makes sense. Have you ever played Exalted?
I have not. I've actually heard some fun things about it, but I've never played it.
The Lunars are the shapeshifters of this world, obviously. And they get a spirit form that they can shift between human and that. I haven't read too much on 3rd edition's Lunars. I know that just came out. But Lunars can then take a beast form between their spirit shape and their regular shape, regardless of what their spirit shape is. So you could be a giant hamster monster ripping out people's eyes if you so chose. But on top of that, it goes into other shape-shifting mythology. So as a Lunar, you can hunt other animals for a couple hours, and then you pounce on them, rip out their hearts, eat the heart, and then you're able to take that animal's form forevermore.
That's very interesting.
And the last one is that they did have a knack, which is a shape-shifting power that allowed them to change genders regardless. So if they chose for all their forms, so their human form would become just the other gender, the opposite gender equivalent of the one that they currently were.
Is that the /group that has the canonically genderqueer character? Because I vaguely remember something like that from Exalted, but I'm not sure if that's...
Exalted has a lot of canonically genderqueer, trans characters, and gay and bisexual characters specifically. There's a lot of bisexual characters in Exalted.
That's really cool. Something that, like, for Werewolf, I think one of the things I'm most sore about for Werewolf is Changing Ways 20th anniversary. I am not sure if you two followed the controversy about it. It was basically just that some authors were not happy about the things that were put in the finished product, and those things that they were not happy about was that the basic ideas, like for years people have been asking how do Garou who are trans experience the world, and the way that I feel Changeways explained that is kind of awful, because while I do acknowledge that the Garou are a traditionalist and in many ways just shitty culture, I don't think it's okay to go and say, oh, actually, if you're trans and you're Garou, at best you're being treated like a third class citizen, and at worst they're just gonna skin you alive and murder you. That's literally almost ad verbum what the book says. And it was yeah.
Oh, I got the book. I got to that part. I'm like, not in my game.
That's yeah. That's also what I think, and I think even in the like context of the book, it doesn't make sense. Because the first assumption is that Garou who are trans cannot do hormone therapy because hormones are in some way of the weaver, which just doesn't make any sense, because the hormones that I take in like medication form, in the form of a gel, is exactly identical to the one that someone who was assigned female at birth generates in their body naturally. There's no difference, and there's no way that it would be off the weaver, unless for example, Pentex produced or like some other corporation associated with the Weaver produced hormones that specifically do that. But hormones in itself are just a natural thing, and them being taken in pill form or as a gel doesn't change their makeup at all. And then the second thing is that the book specifically said that things like tattoos and piercings and body mods are entirely possible, even saying that this is okay and possible because of the rule of cool. Then they go and say, actually, but if you're transgender and you want surgery, well, it sucks to be you, guess you die. And it's just, it's a really, really weird thing to me, because especially, like, a couple weeks ago, I went and read the thing again. Because I read it like when it came out, and then I just sort of like stashed it because I wasn't happy with it. But then like I went and read the whole thing again, mostly because I'm playing in a new game and I wanted to like involve myself with it again, especially because some of the things that I know from lore from the older editions seem to be revised in that book. Like the fact that in the older editions it said that the children of Gaia, for example, do not openly, at least, do not openly oppose the tenet of the litany that forbids Garou with Garou relations. And then Changing Ways actually says that they do openly oppose that. That's something that someone told me about, which was interesting to me. But so I went and reread the whole thing from front cover to back, and it was very obvious to me that some things were written before those sort of transphobic things were put in, and they just never bothered to change them. Because one of the characters that's mentioned as an NPC is actually a Latina trans woman that lives with a kinfolk, and that it says that they're trying to conceive a child, and they're seeing a fertility doctor and all that kind of stuff, and it just seems very nice. And it's not like the way that the book describes how trans Garou are treated, I wouldn't expect that. And it just was very obvious to me that they wrote that and then added all the transphobic bits on top of it for some reason, and just didn't redo the things that were like affirming and not shitty. And that's kind of a thing that just like amazes me in a bad way, because it's just there's the consistency just is lacking.
No,
I think
I agree.
Yeah. But that's basically like, this book is like the thing I'm most sore about with Werewolf, I think, in general. Do not like this book. There are some... The sad thing is that a lot of things in this book are really good, and it's a good resource, but that part of the book just really made me feel bad, and it just made me very upset in some ways, because this is a game that is in many ways my favorite game ever, and I've spent 1,000 hours playing and running this. And then to like have someone just go there and be like, actually, the people in this game think you're subhuman, and at best you're just gonna be treated like shit, and at worst they're gonna murder you. That's like if I want that, I can go in real life, because it's what happens to a lot of trans people, especially trans women of color and black trans women in real life. Like it's nothing new. It's not something edgy or interesting in the lore of a game, because that's just business as usual for a lot of us.
Yeah. I guess there's some controversy surrounding By Night Studios right now. I don't know a ton about it, to be honest, because I don't LARP. But I do know that the Werewolf the Apocalypse Mind's Eye Theater Edition, which takes place in an alternate path where, you know, the apocalypse didn't happen, the Red Star disappeared, is that the Black Furies accept trans women, and that Pegasus absolutely says trans women are women.
Yeah.
And like they treat it so much better. And it's, or the revised storyteller's guide, that handles, like, it doesn't specifically touch on queer topics, but it, I think, handled how the Garu experience better than Changing Ways as well.
I think the whole thing with Pegasus and the Black Furies, which is, I'm not sure if you're on the Onyx Path forums, there's a huge thread about that, where a lot of good points were brought up, a lot of really bad points were brought up, a lot of people, I think, got banned for being really shitty. But the thing that I always bring to the table with that discussion is that, first of all, spirits aren't physical in their bodies the way that we are, and I think a lot of spirits would have a hard time wrapping their heads around the concept of a binary gender, or of gender in general. Because while Gaia is seen as the mother, she just is, in my headcanon, she is that because it's something that humans understand, that the way that fits into the narrative that we have of gender. But the way that, like, nature works, and that many species and animal types do not have the genders that we do and have the sexes that we categorize things in, I don't see spirits working that neatly and that simply. And then the thing is that if you look at the Black Furies in particular, and Pegasus, you actually have this very interesting thing that Pegasus was originally male, got abused and gelded by a Greek hero, and then started being referred to as female and as she, or as it. The Black Furies in most of the canon writing either refer to Pegasus as she or as it. And in the original writing, Pegasus was male because Pegasus got gelded by a Greek hero. And that, to me, is just, like, even more, like, it just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't accept trans women, you know, with all that. Because their concept is about being for femininity and all that stuff. They're not about specifically the experiences of cis women or heterosexual women or anything like that. So I think it doesn't make sense to say that they would not accept it. That's not to say that some individual Black Furies, especially elders, aren't opposed to that, because the way that the big thing in Garou culture is that they are very much still humans, even if they don't like it. Like, even the Red Talons have those human things that they make them stand out, and that make them that shape a big part of their character that are not found in any animals. Like, if you look at the Red Talons and you have their rights about making humans suffer and making them feel pain and torturing them in a way that they think gratifies Gaia as their mother goddess, torture is not a thing that most animals engage in at all. Wolves, not at all. And so that's a very human thing. So I do think that the Black Furies as a tribe would have people who are opposed to trans rights, but I don't think that the totem itself would be opposed to that, I guess.
I agree with that. I actually would have always ruled, and I think I said it in the Onyx Path forums or in a comment section somewhere regarding Werewolf, in that there might be like a camp of Black Furies that are TERFs, but they're the same kind of camp that you'd have as like the Eaters of the Dead for the Silent Striders, in that their hatred is corrupting them, and they are basically spirals in everything but name.
Yeah, and the thing is that like the way that that's structured, the way that camps work, usually have a camp that embodies the worst of the tribe, and that's just a thing that all the tribes have. Like the Glasswalkers have the Cyber Dogs, the Get Fenris have the Swords of Heimdall, and the Black Furies. I don't actually know what their camp is. Do they not have that?
I don't.
I don't recall it.
I don't think they did. I think they avoided that for the for any of the tribes who specifically. Well, that's not true because the Wendigo have the buffalo dance, which is incredibly culturally insensitive.
Yeah, that is also one thing that I personally think is important, because the way that I play the game, I've reworked some of the things. For example, I have reworked the Wendigo to be called the Oshimayans and made their culture a bit less insensitive. I've specifically asked some people with native blood about it, and the issue with the name alone, the way that I was explaining is that the Wendigo as a being isn't a being that's revered in any way in the cultures that it springs from. It's more like the Antichrist or something like that, in a way that it's seen as a terrible being that people are afraid of, to the point where they don't mention the name and will refuse to say the name. And while I think that the Garou in parts could embody that, I don't think that culturally it wouldn't make sense for that to be their patron spirit. And so I've basically replaced the patron spirit that they originally had with the patron spirit being the North Wind, because I think it has the same general vibe without being terribly shitty. And that's actually something I've done for multiple tribes, because the way that my game is run, that I have multiple players who, for example, are neo-pagans who worship Egyptian gods or the Norse gods. I did not want to have the whole thing with, oh, Set is an immortal vampire god who posed as a god, or the whole thing that all the Norse gods are actually vampires and the Get Fenris hate all of them. Because the way that Norse paganism and the way that Kemetic paganism, which is Egyptian paganism, is structured, none of those deities are in themselves evil or bad. They are, unlike some other religions, they're not as clear about good and evil, because the way that, for example, Norse paganism is, you have Loki, who's the adversary to many of the gods, who birthed a lot of the monsters that the gods fight, like Fenris, for example, but he's still not evil in the same way that, for example, Christian religion portrays the devil to be, in the way that he's just evil and nothing more. There are more varied characters, like their characteristics and personality. That's why something I wanted to make sure of is that the way I explain the lore is not insensitive to the people I'm playing with, which is why, for example, I have said that there were vampires who took the names of Thor, of Set, of other gods, but those vampires were imposters and were not the original beings that took those names, because the way that like werewolf works, that a lot of those gods could be or would be patron spirits in their own right. Like Loki is a face of Coyote as a totem.
Yeah. I go slightly the other way. What I typically do is I sit down my players and went, all the religions are false and all of them spring from one of the triad in some sort of way to obfuscate the truth. So like in Christianity, I actually have that Jesus, God, and the devil are actually all different aspects of the Weaver. Because, you know, Jesus with his specific tenets, Satan being the representation of giving the apple of knowledge to man and thus actually springing their intelligence, and of course God as a fatherly patron that keeps humanity going and saying that humanity must rule over nature, all Weaverish. And then I do similar things with other religions across the world, or that they were inspired by specific spirits.
That makes sense. The thing that about like that the like canon of the World of Darkness about this kind of thing, that's sort of I don't like is the fact that, like, according to the canon of the World of Darkness, God, spelled with capital G, capital O, capital G, the creator of the entire universe, is a being that existed and cannot be turned his back on the universe, but he is basically exactly the Christian God. And I do not think that it's fair to say that, like, all other gods and things that people pray to are mere spirits in the greater tapestry of the universe, while God, the creator, in all caps, is the creator of everything and basically all-powerful. That's why I sort of like went the way that I did, but the way you do it makes also makes sense, I think.
Which book was that? I know that it's never stated in Werewolf. I thought it was kind of stated in Vampire, because Vampire is more Judeo-Christian.
Yeah, Vampire and Demon for the most part has a lot of stuff about that.
Okay.
It's also interesting because in like I have to say I'm not as well versed in Demon or Vampire lore as I am in Werewolf. Werewolf is definitely the biggest of my interests, but the way that I understand Demon is that basically the angels of God, of the creator, foresaw a great tragedy that would happen to the universe, obviously the apocalypse, and they basically isolated themselves from God and started like debating about it. And the first one who actually made a decision was Lucifer, Morningstar, the highest of the angels, who decided, you know what, I'm going against God, and I'm going to revolt against God to stop this terrible thing from happening. And that's why the demons were cast into the abyss to be contained there, in theory for eternity, but at some point the bonds that held them lessened and they were freed upon the world. And the way that like Demon has its splats is that basically your identity is derived on whether or not you still believe that God is good and God is right, or that you think that God in itself is wrong and is bad and is a bully that is like didn't want to step up when the whole thing he created was in danger of being destroyed. And the way that you see humanity, because some demons in Demon see themselves as having aided humanity and wanting to improve the standing of humanity and saving humanity from the terrible things that are going to happen, and others want to corrupt humanity and drag them down with them, basically. That's kind of like the thing. But Demon, the Fallen, and Vampire have the like most discussion, as far as I understand, of like this whole thing. But the way that like Demon says it is basically that God, the creator, created the universe. He created everything. Apparently also the triad is kind of implied, and all that kind of stuff. And that to me, who comes from Werewolf, doesn't make sense, because for me it just makes more sense to just ignore that and say that, for example, the Christian God is a facet of the Weaver or something like that, because to me it doesn't feel fair to say that the deities of various religions that still have followers and active participants in the current age are all like minor spirits who like kinda didn't do much and didn't create the universe. Oh, but the Christian God is God, the creator, who created everything. That just doesn't seem fair to me.
I agree with that. I also think that for me personally, it's if I was running a demon game, then sure, I'd go more to the meta plot confirming a Judeo-Christian God, because that's just the universe of Demon, and then less so in a Werewolf game, because the Werewolf game definitely deals with the Umbra more. I definitely change the rules of the universe based on the game, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's like the thing where like while a lot of things are able to have like a mix of the different games, I'm lacking the word right now, crossover, where most of the games have the possibility for a crossover. Some of the things just don't mix well, and yeah, that's okay in my opinion, because they don't necessarily have to mix entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vampire would be lessened if it didn't do the Cain and Abel thing for the majority of things, because that was interesting, versus if it tried to work in actually the Weaver created vampires and the worm corrupted them or something like that. That works for a Werewolf game, but it's uninteresting in a Vampire game because it takes the focus away from Vampire and puts it on Werewolf.
Yeah, and something that I also really like is how every supernatural splat basically goes, oh, actually, I can explain this, and just completely misunderstands everything. Like how the changelings say that the Garou are actually a type of changeling that got banished from the dreaming, or like how the Garou say that vampires are a type of mixed Fomori/drone made up of weaver and worm energy and that kind of stuff. I think it's kind of funny in a parody kind of way where it's like everyone saying I'm right and I know everything and nobody else knows anything, but people are not right because a lot of things aren't as clear cut and like simple and easy to explain as people make them out to be. Something that I also think is fun in like this whole like crossover thing is to like have players just run away with stuff in the way that I imply something and I'm not even like, for example, the game that I run. So the game that I've been running since roughly 2016 with breaks is called The Beating City Heart, with the other title being Anarchist Werewolves, because it's basically a group of Garou who follows the patron spirit Mother Anarchy, who is basically the philosophical embodiment of the like idea of anarchism and mutual aid, like the idea that everyone should be equal. And the way that the game is run, it's set in Moscow. There's a lot of like urban fantasy things involved. But another thing is that I just take the players all over the map because we're a very international group. We've got players from Australia. We've got one player from Japan. We've got one player from America. We've got players from Europe, like me, and I run the game. And so we just kind of like take it all over the map. And one thing that we had in the recent plot was that the pack was in southern Germany in the Schwarzwald region, which is actually fairly close to where I live, not exactly here, but I've been there. I've been to the specific like lake resort that they were at as a child, and the basic thing is that they were investigating some worm-related activity where Magadon was trying to build a factory that was supposed to taint a lake cairn that the river that the factory was supposed to be situated at fed into. And the thing is that I just sort of described a Fomori who was working at a local store as having this hungry look about him. And for some reason that kind of made the next, I think, 4 sessions evolve into a wild goose chase where everyone was a vampire and everything was ran by vampires. Another thing in that session was that I had a player see the Magadon logo and botch their role to investigate, and so I was like, this is definitely the McDonald's logo. And they sort of like went to McDonald's, saw this Fomori dude, and were like, okay, McDonald's is run by vampires. And that was just that just kind of like took over a bunch of episodes. It was really funny because while I did not plan for there to even be vampires, I sort of like ended up making a plot into it, and that kind of fed into the longer overarching plot that I kind of created. Okay. It's really interesting. What I was like trying to say is that it's interesting how players a lot of the time will just completely derail the game in some ways, but in a good way, because it's like they make a plot that's better than what you came up with originally.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And actually, I just thought of a question now that you'd been speaking about the game and all your different kinds of players. How do you think German gaming culture differs from what you've heard about American gaming culture, and how do you think your diverse groups gaming culture diverges from that?
I think that German gaming culture, just like gaming culture globally, is getting more and more understanding and open and less ignorant about a lot of things. But I do think that the way that Germany works, we're still behind some things that, for example, the American public has been speaking about for a while, like general things like racism. There is a so with everything going on right now politically, there's been a lot of talk also in Germany, and there's been like protests, and my town has been speaking about like working through racist things in the city's history. And one thing that like is a thing that I don't think would exist in America anywhere but the deepest south is that we literally have stores here using like racist caricatures of black people as their marketing, or we have a bar called to the N-word, in the German N-word, and I think that's something that would not be a thing in America anymore, at least not anywhere but the worst regions at all. And that's why I think that in some ways that Germany is a little behind some of the things. A lot of issues are less pronounced here. Police brutality still exists, even if a lot of people will try to tell you it does not exist. Police brutality absolutely exists in Germany. We have structural and societal racism, absolutely. But some things are not talked about as much as they are in America, which in parts may be because they're less pronounced to the casual onlooker. But the people who are suffering from these issues, they absolutely experience those things, and it's absolutely a thing. The way that I see it changing in recent times is that I think we're making a sort of stride towards more inclusive gaming and less ignorance. Because, so for example, I live in a sort of metropolitan town in a rural area, so it's the largest city in this area, but it's still not huge. And we've got I think we've got 2 gaming stores in this area. I have only been to one. Due to my disability, I can't really go out much, and I haven't been to that one in years, actually. But I've been to it back in 2016, and I still follow them on social media. And something that they've actually came up with, or that they instituted recently, is that they came out with a sort of charter that explains which kind of behaviors are not accepted in the store, and that includes racist and sexist and homophobic and transphobic behavior. And I think it's really important that we're now speaking about these things and addressing these things, because even when a lot of people have ignored that these things existed and just pointed the finger at, for example, the United States, and said those things only happen in the United States, they absolutely happen all over. They happen everywhere, from Japan to Australia to Canada to the United States to Germany to France to Scandinavia. Racism is a global thing, and it's not something that only exists in an isolated local issue. And I think as a community, gaming is making strides towards a more inclusive scene, but I also think that a lot of things still need to very much be worked on in that way. I see, I try to be mindful and speak about other types of oppressions. Obviously, I know the most about the type of things that concern autistic people and trans people. And the way that I've experienced the gaming culture that we have in Germany is that, for example, roughly 2 years ago, I very abruptly left one of the largest role-playing groups that we have in Germany, because it was Pride Month, like a Facebook group. It was Pride Month. Someone posted about queer pride, and what it devolved into is roughly a 2-week-long thread where people just kept shitting on queer people and saying that we're mentally ill and we don't deserve human rights and stuff like that. And what the group's admins did was basically just do nothing about it. They just basically pointed the finger sometimes, were like, please don't resort to personal attacks, but they didn't actually stop anything of that. And I think in a way that's kind of a symptom of what the culture is, because we still have this prevalent culture of people being ignorant, being willfully ignorant, and being shitty towards minorities of all kinds. And I think that we are getting better, but we still have a lot of work to do in that way.
Okay. I do hate to shatter your illusions about the United States, but we had a pancake brand that had a caricature of a house slave on it, and it was removed from those boxes last week.
Yeah, no, I've heard about that. I'm very up to date about the United States politics and all that.
Okay.
What I meant was more that in the United States you have this greater spectrum of things. You have some areas that are progressive, where people at least pay lip service to being inclusive and not being shitty, and you have areas that are really shitty still. But I think in Germany we just have this more widespread culture of ignorance, where people are like, oh, I just don't know the correct language. And it's like, well, you never made the effort of looking it up, for example. That's a very prevalent thing that I see, I think.
Okay. I think there is a lot of that still in the United States, regardless of where you go, regardless of how progressive the city is, from my own personal experience. Actually, we don't have any stores, to my knowledge, anywhere that uses the N-word in the title, which is, I guess, progress.
It's not much, but it's not much, but it's something. The thing in Germany is that you have this lasting fascination with our, for example, colonial past. And while a lot of Germany openly rejects the things that, for example, Nazi Germany did, and while those things have in large parts been spoken about, which, by the way, does not mean that we are a just like utopia, because we still have neo-Nazi. We've had a active neo-Nazi party since a couple of years after the war. There's the alt-right, there's a lot of stuff like that, but those things are at least paid lip service to being against by the general public. But you still have this lasting fascination with the German colonial state. Because Germany only had colonies for a couple decades. Germany gained their colonies right before World War One, lost them after World War One. So we didn't have them for a long time, but there's still a lot of fascination and glorification of those things. And that, I think, is in parts why those things are still in popular culture and marketing. It's also a thing in, like, for example, the Netherlands. A thing in the Netherlands that's kind of become more widely known in recent years is that, for example, they have the helper slash assistant of Santa Claus is a racist caricature of a black guy. And that's something that a lot of people in the Netherlands are still very much okay with being that way. And obviously there are a lot of people who are openly and just really vocally against that. But in popular culture, it's still very much a thing, because in Europe, a lot of people still associate those caricatures with, like, this idealized, beautified and glorified idea of, like, the colonial past, when absolutely colonialism and the things that have come from it and the effects that still permeate are horrendous and are absolutely terrible things and definitely need to be addressed more.
Agreed. You have any questions, Brennan?
Oh, I do have a question. We got away from the STEM, but you mentioned preparing for your games. What do you do? Do you tailor your game to your players, or do you think of a story and then work them in?
Equally. I have specific plots that are made from background things of the player. We've actually got 3 Metis characters in the game. 2 of them are half siblings. Their father really got around. And their parents are sort of a thing that's involved in plots. For example, one character is a Metis who joined the Bone Gnawers, but whose parentage that is still alive, the father died, is a Silverfang of high pure breeding. And the way that I can say it without having too much spoilers, so I'm not sure if my players are going to listen to this, it looks like the mother is trying to subtly involve herself in her child's life. And the child themselves is not really sure if that is just to depose of them and just murder them, or something like that. And the character, the Metis themselves, is very suspicious and not really all that open about, like, going into this relationship. And I think that that's one way that I try to involve the backstories and the specific things that the character has and their attitudes into the game. Or, for example, another thing is that another character in the game, Layla, is a Bone Gnawer, and they have a mentor who's a Silent Strider. So naturally, they were raised with the idea that vampires are the scourge of the earth and absolutely need to be eradicated. And I came up with this plot line. There was a solo plot for this player that was just them and me role-playing. And this is also something that I'm planning to do with all of the characters, having solo plots just to further deepen the character and their personality. But this solo plot was basically that Layla, the character, was supposed to investigate this bar in Moscow that supposedly had a vampire problem, quote unquote. And it sort of became a love story between a vampire and the werewolf, because as it happened, the vampire is actually not a morally corrupt creature that's awful, but rather actually tries to not be overtly predatory and shitty towards humans, and basically tries to like make the best out of her unlife without harming people and being predatory, basically. And there was a whole thing about like bone lords in the area being shitty towards humans and like extorting bar owners and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it sort of started this like very delicate romance between Layla and the character, the vampire character, and that's something that I plan to have come up for future things, especially because the way that their relationship started is because Bonor tried to attack and kill the vampire and was basically fought off by Layla. And the way that it looks now, this Bonor actually created a completely false story and retelling of what happened, saying that he was attacked by at least 20 vampires and 5 black spiral dancers, as to not lose face about the fact that he was like, he got fucked up by like a like almost cub, actually Clyath, alone and all that kind of stuff. So it's going to be interesting. That's a sort of thing where I try to make individual plots that like involve specific character traits and things that I want the character and the player to think about that I think would be interesting to them. But in addition to that, I also have overarching plots that have a longer running story that I originally came up with. The game is called The Beating City Heart, and what that comes from is the fact that the way that I see Moscow in the World of Darkness is that there's this umbral pocket realm, which is basically an embodiment of the city itself. It's called the Undercity, and it's basically a condensed umbral reflection of Moscow, but also of cities in general. This realm is existing under the control slash influence of rat, as rat, and in smaller parts also cockroach as totems, and this is a thing that was the original concept for this campaign, and this campaign has been going since roughly 2016 or 15, and it's actually only now that this thing that was name giving for this campaign has actually come up, because I just come up with so many plots and ideas that I want to do, and it just sort of is a thing where I have a Google Doc sheet where I have something like 200 plot points that I will at some point bring in, and usually I just like have this open, and if my players have their characters do something that might warrant anything of that coming up, I just kind of flip through it and go, okay, this is what happens, and just kind of like involve that with the plot to like make the world seem dynamic and make the world interesting for the players, basically.
That's very cool. I like that a lot.
Do you ever run into the problem where you have a setting you want to explore or a story you want to tell in particular, but you don't know how to work it in or don't have enough time? Like, how many games do you have running at any particular point?
I only run one game, and I play in one game with the other werewolf game being paused. I still have a Pathfinder game that's kind of in the making where I'm playing, but that actually hasn't really come to fruition. And there's another vampire game that is a one-shot that I'm going to be part of, but I only have those 2 games that are currently going on. So it's not really a time thing. And I also don't really have any settings that I'm dying to try out that I can't. The way that the werewolf game that I run is structured is that I can basically bring up a lot of different types of settings. Like, for example, we had this like extremely rural setting in southern Germany where the Gelderfenris have their own cairn in the forest, and there's a mixed cairn in like near the at the Wild Lake and all that stuff, which is like a very rural and more classical Garou thing. But there's also the main setting, which is Moscow, where you like have this like urban cairn that's trying to arrange itself with other things. There's actually 2 cairns there. There's a Bone Arrow cairn, which is the cairn of the Beating City Heart, and there's the Glasswalker cairn that I've taken from canon, which is the Sept of the Learning Hole. And I basically, when I want to bring in a setting that doesn't immediately fit, I just make it a tour or travel thing. Like, for example, something that I really like conceptually is this like small town horror thing. I grew up in a small rural German village, and something to me that always was interesting to me was this idea of this like village and small town horror. Like for example, one past plot was that the pack was tasked by a Silverfang in service to King Albrecht to go to this remote village east of Moscow and just like look at stuff, because there's just weird stuff going on there. Nobody really knows what it is. And what it actually was that there was a cult of human cultists who were basically sacrificing humans to a thunderworm. The thunderworm actually doesn't actually care about the sacrifices, anything like that. I don't think they're intelligent enough for that. But what's basically happening is that this thunderworm emerged from the earth roughly every 20 years to wreak havoc and destroy stuff and kill people. And those human cultists had basically convinced themselves that they had everything under control, because as long as they kept making human sacrifices, the thunderworm, who in their opinion was a servant of God the Lord, would only kill people that they disliked, which was not actually factual, but that's how they saw it. And that was kind of like their way of explaining it and making it feel safer for them. But the pack basically went to this village and started investigating, and they found this like shed in the woods with like animal and human remains and all that kind of stuff, and it culminated with this like battle on the open plain where the pack was fighting the thunderworm with the help of a pack of ronin that randomly showed up. But the thing is that, like what I was saying, is that if I want to have a setting and I want to bring it up, I just try to work it into the story. Like another story that's upcoming would be taking place in South America. And it's just a way that I bring different settings that are like in. And with other systems, I don't really have any settings that I really, really want to play. I like Cyberpunk, I like Shadowrun a lot, but I don't really have the itching to play that as a system. I've been thinking about maybe running a Cyberpunk War of the Apocalypse setting, but that's still a very far away thought that I'm not really sure about.
Okay. Yeah, because I have this problem. I jump from game to game to game mentally. Like Exalted with the high fantasy, high control, where you're the movers and shakers of the world rather than trying to stop the movers and shakers of the world of like Werewolf. I also think, just because of the diversity of your group, I think you would like Scion 2nd Edition. It's a lot more well-researched than the 1st edition one. And it does the great idea of that all the mythology that is presented is true.
Yeah.
They all exist.
I like Scion a lot conceptually. I've had a bit of a bad experience with it, so to say. Does America have Free RPG Day? Is that a thing over there?
Yeah, we do.
So I think it came from America to here, but something that happened at the Free RPG Day years ago is that I was at a public library where they were doing the Free RPG Day, and I was already mainly into RPGs, so I was just there, kind of like support the scene and all that kind of stuff. And this dude was running Scion, and we picked our characters, and he's sort of like, we basically decided on a concept and what like deity we wanted to be descendant of, and he like gave us a character sheets in accordance to that. And I was a daughter of Freya, the Norse goddess of magic and love, and an item that appeared on my character sheet was literally a magic dildo for some reason. And that would have been uncomfortable and weird, but there were also minors involved in that game session, and I was just really uncomfortable with that. And there was this sort of a thing that kind of turned me off from Scion for a bit. I might look into it to run it at some point, because it does seem interesting. That's just sort of the only thing I relate to Scion as a game.
That's fair. Christ. The first edition is kind of a mechanical mess. The second one definitely does a bit of a better job, though I do think that the organization of Scion Origins and some of the information about it is kind of a hot mess as well. The hero book, which is the default for me, just because of first edition, I really like. So you'd have to dip 2 books in to really get the most out of Scion, in my opinion.
Yeah, it definitely sounds interesting, and I think I will look into it when I like find the time. What I will like the way that I like kind of work is that I often like obsess over a single thing, and for a while, and that's usually my werewolf game, which is also how I like. I think you saw me posting on the Discord about that. Is that sometimes I just have these intense phases of productivity where I just start working on something and suddenly it's 6 a.m. the next morning and I'm like, oh, I should sleep. That's kind of like how I make the game and how I write the plot, because I just like will sometimes I'll lay in bed and I just like am right before falling asleep and I'm like, you know what, this is a cool plot point, and I kind of like get up again and start writing, and that's just sort of how I write the game's plot basically.
Okay. Yeah, I do a lot of feverish writing for the Septs, for example, because I am working on a story telling vault product now, which will be the Sept of the Sacred Stone from the really podcast. Cool. So that will be going up eventually. I write slow, especially for story path products.
That's fair. That's really cool. I'm going to look into that. That sounds really good.
Yeah, so I put in like a little disclaimer at the beginning going, what's in the name? And I say that the Uktena and the Wendigo are tribal names, are sacred or taboo to native cultures, and that they are forever referred to as older and younger brother from that point on.
That makes sense. That's the way that I explained earlier, where I renamed the Wendigo into Oshimeans and have their patrons. But there's also a thing, I try to not use the word totem. I usually say patron spirit, because the way that the word totem is associated just in the first place doesn't really fit for a lot of the things that are presented as totems in the books, like Clashing Boom Boom or, for example, Almighty Dollar. All those are only vaguely related to what the term meant in the original sense, and I try to say patron spirit. Yeah.
That makes sense. But yeah, so I've been working on that, so that will be a thing at some point.
That's really cool.
Are there other World of Darkness games that really, really speak to you as well? Like, do you like Vampire? Have you ever thought about running Wraith or Mage?
I have played Vampire on a couple odd occasions. The werewolf game that I'm still in, that's kind of paused right now, periodically try to play other games, and it just never took off as much as the werewolf did. I played in a Vampire Dark Ages game, where I played a Toreador countess, and it was just sort of wacky and it was interesting, definitely, but it never gripped me as much as Werewolf did, and neither did any of the other games. Like, we've tried Changeling, and all those, and Changeling is the one, Changeling and Mage are the ones that speak to me the most still. But that is mostly because the way that the games are written is more inclusive towards minorities of all kinds than, for example, Werewolf. Like, for example, a book that I frequently consult for my Werewolf game is the Mage 20th Anniversary Gods and Monsters, I think is the name. Which is a source book with a bunch of like spirits and like different types of characters and things like that. And what like amazed me about it is that you have this in the first part of the book, you have this like list of a couple of characters who are like detailed as being in the book. And I think one very upset commenter on the Drive-Thru RPG put it very nicely. He said he was very angry because there were very, very many diverse characters, and it was a SJW wet dream or something like that. And that's honestly, if someone criticizes a book as being that, you can bet your money I would have spent money on it. Like, I just like diverse characters, and I want my games to be diverse, and I don't like if that's not a thing. And I think if a game starts out by presenting those things, then it's good already, and I can appreciate that. Like, for example, one of the characters in the Gods and Monsters book that I remember Farewell is a autistic boy, or that there's a genderqueer person in the book who's detailed as a character, and all those kind of things. And I think those are interesting character concepts. And I think that gaming and storytelling can gain a lot from having diverse characters, because like obviously you could play the 360s grizzled white dude whose wife died and his daughter is in peril, and now he needs to step up and rejoin the Fianna as an Arun. No, I'm not speaking about a specific game, but like this thing where like this like a lot of games have those like just cookie cutter characters, and that seems boring to me. So I do like having this kind of diversity in the characters that are told.
Mm-hmm. I guess I didn't oops all allegory the Sept of the Sacred Stone, which I'm happy for, but I thought I was a little too on the nose of the theme because, with the exception of Regender as the elder, almost all of the native Garu in that Karen, at least who are of the older brother tribe, are people of color, typically of Hispanic native descent, but almost all of the Sept positions are controlled by outsider white other tribes.
Yeah, that's something that actually my partner, who I was listening to the podcast with, remarked. They said they be colonizing, because that's basically like very very aptly put that. Like the struggle that I as a listener see in the Sept is that like you have the children of Gaia embodied by Regenda who say we are trying to take care of things by controlling things and not giving the people who the place probably rightfully should belong to agency. That's an interesting. I like that as a concept, and I like that as a conflict in a game.
And then you have Teresa, who is like, we want more of our Karen back. You re-invited us in as a show of unity, and then it stopped there. Except with her as Master of Right, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and that's a really interesting conflict in the Sept. I think that a conflict that I have in my Sept, that the Sept of the Beating City Heart, while being less a allegory for real life things, is that you have both the Shadow Lords under the guidance of Yuri Konietzko and the Silverfangs under King Albrecht, who in my game is already king, but still is contested by others, both vying for the support of the Sept, because Moscow, in the way that it works, is in the middle of the map, basically. And they're trying to get that point as a node for moon bridges, basically.
Okay.
The way that I have the whole leadership of the Garu Nation thing set up in my game is that you have Yuri Konietzko, who says, it's not the time for prophecies and destined kings. We have to take action. You have King Albrecht, who says, I am going to find the silver crown. He's already king, but he still needs the crown to basically verify his claim. And you have the traditionalist European Silverfangs under the leadership of Tamara Tvarevich, who are basically saying that King Albrecht is not the right one to do it because he's too adventurous. He's doing too many risks, and in a sort of representation of American politics, basically saying we need to be less overt about being progressive so we can have a safe leadership.
Okay, I like that. We've been doing that. But I lost it.
That's okay. It happens.
I think we're getting close to the end of the podcast, so we're going to ask you our typical question. If resources, time, people was not a factor, what would be the ideal game for you to run? What would your dream game be?
I think I alluded to that earlier. I don't really have that. I'm very much content with the game I run, and that basically is the dream game, because I came up with this concept in basically a fever dream, and I started fleshing it out. and I started running it, and that's sort of the dream game that I want to be running, really. I like the conflicts of the game. I like the way that the pack functions. I am very happy with how the players play their characters. The setting is a dream for me, and it's basically my dream game already.
Perfect. You might be the first, and hopefully, though, not the last person who is able to play their dream game. Is there any place on social media or anything that you want to be found at?
No, I don't really think so.
That's fine.
I do use social media, but I don't really use it for public stuff. I write slam poetry under the name of Scarlett Miller, but that's about like the publicity stuff that I do.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I want to thank you for coming on to the show. I know the time difference makes it a bit more of a challenge.
What time is it for you right now again?
It's not too bad. It's only 11:20.
Okay. Yeah, it's 7 here. But I also want to thank you for inviting me to the game. That's very grand. I enjoy that.
Of course. And so Keegan here signing off with Brennan.
Have a good night, everybody.
And you can find us on Facebook, Podbean, YouTube, but you will never, and Apple Podcasts, but you'll never find me on Twitter. I find it a cesspool. Bye.